COVID-19 pandemic has grounded most civilian aircraft, but those planes will be flying again, or at least many of them will, emitting greenhouse gases, more than half a ton of carbon dioxide per person on a flight from New York to London. That's about as much as a typical person living in Ghana emits in a whole year. And it's not even a round trip. We can all hope that all this distributed working will make us fly less, Zoom to conferences instead of jetting to them. But even if we did that, we won't save the planet. Passenger flights generate just 2% of all the greenhouse gases that we humans pump into the air every year. 2%. Now, you know this massive global lockdown that we're under? How much do you think it's really cutting greenhouse gas emissions? 10%? 20%? 30%? Guess again. The answer, according to Carbon Brief, is that global greenhouse gas emissions will be 5.5% lower this year compared to 2019. 5.5%. Another question, how deeply do we have to cut emissions if we're going to prevent global temperatures from rising to the point at which climate models start going haywire and all bets are off? How deeply, in other words, do we have to cut emissions if we're to meet the Paris Agreement target of preventing global temperatures from rising to a level 1.5 degrees Celsius or 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit above pre-industrial levels? Again, keep in mind that during this very crazy COVID-19 year, when we're all sitting at home, we may achieve the deepest single-year emission reduction in man-made greenhouse gases since forever. This year's emission reductions will be the deepest by far in human history, and we're talking 5.5%. But how much do we have to cut every year between now and 2030 if we're to meet the Paris Agreement target and save civilization, because that is what we're talking about? The answer, according to the United Nations Environment Programme's 2019 Emissions Gap Report, is 7.6%. Every year, including this year, through to 2030. That means if we don't cut emissions 7.6% this year, we're already behind. And it looks like we won't get there despite having blundered into the deepest emission reduction in history. Now, a lot of people are chattering away out there about how COVID-19 is going to magically slap the crap out of the science denial movement and accelerate efforts to meet the climate challenge. But here's the reality. I conducted a survey of green entrepreneurs, people who have been working to save endangered forests for a decade at least, and often much longer for Ecosystem Marketplace. You know what their biggest fear was? They were afraid that this convulsive response to COVID-19 could end up derailing or at least distracting from real solutions and the structured response that's emerging under the Paris Climate Agreement. 70% of the people I surveyed said that's what they really feared was going to happen, more than that this would somehow automatically stimulate some kind of organic response. Now, this doesn't mean we can't leverage this moment to meet the climate challenge. We can, and we must. But we can't expect the moment to leverage itself, not in a world where outfits like Koch Industries are continuing to actively spread anti-science propaganda. And we can't expect new technologies or changes in behavior alone to get us out of this mess either. We're all sitting at home, and emissions are still only down 5.5% this year. At the same time, everyone's excited about machines that can suck carbon out of the atmosphere, and I've covered that too. Way back in 2017, I covered it. We need that technology, and it's getting closer and closer to reality, but we also need to save forests because industrial emissions are not going to zero in the next 5 or 10 years. They can, however, get to net zero, where they're pulling as much greenhouse gas out of the atmosphere as they put into it. Now, these fancy machines that are going to suck carbon out of the atmosphere, I think they'll be here. But, what do we got right now? Let's look at February. Delta Airlines said they would become the first climate neutral airline in the world, or that means the first airline to have net zero greenhouse gas emissions in the world, meaning not that they would be flying planes that emit no greenhouse gases, because other than Bertrand Piccard's solar glider, which we heard about in 2017 on this show, that doesn't exist. Being climate neutral means that Delta will pull as much greenhouse gas out of the atmosphere as all of its flights pump into it. And their start date isn't 2030 or 2025 or even 2021, and it doesn't rely on some new fancy technology. Their start date is March 1st, 2020, 2 months ago. And they did it. Now, they made this announcement on Valentine's Day, February 14th, and we all know what happened in March. Last week, on Earth Day, Delta CEO Gareth Joyce reiterated the company's net zero pledge in a LinkedIn post entitled, "Sustainability is a long-term commitment." And he's not alone. EasyJet had a similar commitment, although not globally, and they said they're keeping their commitment as well. Air France did too, so did British Airways. All of these airlines say they're already at zero net emissions, either globally, as with Delta, or across some of the routes. And that they've gotten there by either conserving or reviving natural ecosystems like forests that mop up carbon dioxide by the gigaton, or helping farmers manage their land more sustainably. The vehicle by which they achieve this is carbon offsetting, which is a subject I cover a lot on this show, always from a different angle. I hope I'm not repeating myself too much here, although there are some basics I have to kind of reiterate every time I touch on this subject. Now, if you're a regular listener, you know that forestry offsets usually work by addressing deforestation in specific forests. These are called forest carbon projects, standalone projects, as opposed to programs. Projects work, and they work well, but only in isolated areas and not at the scale that's needed to fix this mess. At the same time, you have government-to-government payments designed to help entire states or provinces save their forests. These are called jurisdictional programs. So you have isolated or standalone projects, then you have jurisdictional programs, and finally you have individual projects that nest within jurisdictions. All of these forest carbon programs and projects exist alongside efforts to improve commodity supply chains, which we've also covered a lot on this show. But the question is, how do they fit together? And can offsets be used to actually support jurisdictions? What happens if there's a fire in a project area and the carbon goes up in smoke, literally? Can forest carbon projects fight forest fires? Today's guest, Naomi Swickard, thinks so. And today she's going to tell us how. And you know what? I think she pulls it off. After speaking with her, a lot of stuff that used to make my head explode, now it just makes it itch a little.
Man may be unwittingly changing the world's climate through the waste products of his civilization.
There's a group of us now who are proposing that the Earth has actually entered a new epoch, and that is the Anthropocene.
We know that the enemy is carbon, and we know its ugly face. We should put a big fat price on it, and of course, add to that, drop the subsidies.
Earth, we broke it, we own it. And nothing is as it was. Not the trees, not the seas, not the forests, farms, or fields. And not the global economy that depends on all of these. But we can restore it, make it better, greener, more resilient, more sustainable. But how? Technology? Geoengineering? Are we doomed to live on a bionic planet, or is nature herself the answer? That's the question we address in every episode of Bionic Planet, a podcast of the Anthropocene, the new epoch defined by man's impact on Earth. And today we speak with Naomi Swickard, who is the Chief Program Officer in charge of land-based offsetting standards for Verra, which is the organization that oversees the Verified Carbon Standard, among other initiatives. That means she oversees VCS's work. VCS is a Verified Carbon Standard. She oversees VCS's work on REDD+, which stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Degradation of Forests, plus Enhancement of Carbon Stocks. We did a 3-part series on REDD Plus earlier or in the middle of last year, episodes 49, 50, and 51. REDD Plus essentially means using carbon finance to save forests that are still standing but endangered or degraded. I caught up to her last year at year-end climate talks in Madrid while this COVID-19 idiocy was still percolating out of view in China. So keep that in mind that this interview predates the COVID-19 pandemic. And if you were wondering why it took me so long to get this up, well, quite frankly, I couldn't afford to do it sooner. The one complaint that I get most often from listeners is that I don't do enough episodes. And the reason is that they take time, and time is money. I put a lot of work into sounding like I know what I'm talking about, and I want to generate more episodes, but I also don't want to just phone them in. And I think every episode I do, I really feel like could be done better if I had more time and more resources. If you like my work and want more of it, and if you want me to improve it by maybe getting a good sound guy or just having the time to do a rewrite on this stuff, then help me out by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Bionic Planet. That's patreon.com, patreon.com/Bionic Planet. There you can support me for as little as $1 per episode, although obviously I'd hope you do more. $1 per episode and with a monthly cap. So if you think $5 a month is good, you can do $5 for one episode, but then make that the cap. Or you could also just do $1 an episode and put a $5 cap on it. That way I have to do my 5 episodes. I have to earn my keep in a sense to get the money. Anyway, the address again is patreon.com/Bionic Planet. patreon.com/Bionic Planet.
We have a program called the Jurisdictional and Nested REDD requirements, which allows for accounting and crediting of activities in the forestry sector, especially avoided deforestation and degradation, for a few years now. And the idea of that was really to drive finance to jurisdictional programs that were seeking to transact those units in markets, as well as to integrate those activities at a project scale. What we're doing essentially now is to revise and update that to really account for where we're at now in the REDD space, and things have changed significantly over the last few years.
I don't really even understand how jurisdictional offsets work. I understand how a project works because you're paying a specific person or a specific group in a specific place, but in a jurisdiction, how can there be an offset at such a large scale?
It's a good question,
yeah.
and frankly, that's still untested. Much of the investment and the development of REDD programs, so at a national or subnational scale, to date have been with donor finance money, or under the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. And those have primarily been payment for readiness activities, and they're just now getting to the point that they're signing contracts to be able to pay for results. But those are not really designed for offsets.
Right.
So our Jurisdictional and Nested REDD, or JNR program, was specifically designed to try to create market-ready offset credible units. So you're taking a similar approach to a project in the sense that you're accounting for the deforestation across a whole jurisdiction, and where you have reduced that deforestation and are able to produce an emission reduction, you could turn that into an offset credit. But there's a few additional things that you need to do to make sure that it's really ready to be offset quality rather than just a payment for results. You need a higher level integrity in the baseline or reference level. You need to make sure that the jurisdiction has the right to those units and the ability to trade them, which you don't necessarily always have to have when it's a results-based payment.
Right.
So at the moment, the offsets that are available in this space are from the project level.
Yeah, maybe we can unpack that just a bit, because I don't think everybody knows the difference between a payments for performance and an offset.
Good point.
Do you want to explain that, or should
Sure.
I? Yeah.
So a results-based payment is largely being done from a donor or a multilateral organization. So, for example, the Norwegians have relationships with a number of countries around the world, and they're expecting to see results and pay for them. But those results are not always in emission reductions. Some of those results are having the reference level in place or having policies in place or structures in place that ultimately will get us to emission reductions. So some payments have been made on that, and further payments will be made on emission reductions achieved. But because you're paying the country rather than taking the unit and transferring it to another entity, which is then using it to offset or compensate for its emissions, you can be a bit looser with the requirements, or you don't necessarily need to have the unitization, the serialization of the
Right.
units on a traceable registry, because you don't necessarily need to track who's using and retiring that unit.
Yeah, right. And the reason, again, being that if you're making an offset, you've got a company or somebody someplace who is saying we reduced our net emissions by creating this specific emission reduction, and they have to be able to have this clear cause and effect. They have to be able to say that our money made this emission reduction happen. Mm-hmm. Whereas the other way, you can say, oh yeah, we supported this activity, the emissions went down, we think it helped, but we're not taking any claim for it, so we're not going to get really nitpicky about whether we caused it.
Exactly.
And I guess that's when I get into the question, though, is when I think of a jurisdiction, there's so many actors, so many people in a jurisdiction. How do you get that kind of certainty? I mean, I know enough about carbon accounting to understand how a project works, where you go in and you kind of map out all the drivers of deforestation, and you can say, here's this patch of land, it's a patch of forest, it's in an area, we've seen these actors in this place cause this kind of degradation, the same thing's happening here. We can clearly say if we don't intervene, something bad is going to happen. Mm-hmm. At the jurisdictional level, you're mostly using historical rates of deforestation, right? Or you're not really doing these kind of scenarios.
That's right. But there's been quite a bit of science done to look at what is the best predictor of future deforestation. And they have found that the recent history is a decent predictor of future deforestation. So the issue when you're working at a project level is that you're trying to choose an area that has not yet been deforested. So you can't look at the historical deforestation in that exact place, or you wouldn't have anything. But in reality, the threat is very, very high because they're often on the forest frontier. So that approach doesn't really work when you're looking at a site-specific level. But at the jurisdiction, when you look at the average of deforestation, either the historical average or the historical trend, you can see a fairly decent prediction of what's likely to occur. So what's important is that those reference levels or that estimation of deforestation are revisited fairly frequently, because it's been shown that sort of the recent past, the last 5 to 10 years, is the best predictor of what is likely to occur when you're assessing at scale.
Do you do any kind of looking to see what interventions are being made to really get that, that rigor down?
In terms of setting the reference level or the baseline, those terms, usually reference levels used at a jurisdictional level and baseline is usually used at a project level. You're really relying on the integrity of that reference level to ensure that you're predicting accurately what's going to happen with deforestation going forward. And then you're looking at the change. So the activity itself becomes part of how you implement and how you achieve an emission reduction at a jurisdictional scale, rather than part of the setting of the baseline itself. In a project, you really need to look carefully at the deforestation dynamics on the ground in that specific place and what you're going to do to change them. At a jurisdictional scale, you still need to do that, but it's not built into the reference level so much as the historic information. But it's really important when you go into how you're going to implement your program, how you're actually going to produce emission reductions in that country, which is something that hasn't been focused on as much, really, at the jurisdictional scale yet, and very much needs to be. Right.
Now, who do you see as being the buyers of these jurisdictional offsets? Because if a company is buying an offset, they like to tell the story. They like to say that here's this beautiful forest that we intervened in, this indigenous people were there, we helped them protect their land. And that story isn't as charismatic when you're looking at jurisdictional offsets.
It's a really good point. I think that for most corporates, they are far more comfortable interacting with the project scale. Partially for that reason, they really want the story. They want to be able to say, not only am I reducing my emissions, I'm also helping communities in this country. And these projects do a lot on the ground. They're not just putting a fence around a forest and calling that an emission reduction. They're really working very deeply in communities to really understand the deforestation dynamics, change the direction of livelihoods, and make them less dependent on cutting the forest down. And so that's a really compelling story because it has, oftentimes these projects are also investing in health or education or, investments in timber plantations so to reduce the pressure on the forest. And those have tons of benefits for local communities. So for a corporate that's investing, particularly if they're doing so for voluntary purposes, they're really interested in that story. Now, when you transition into a more compliance or regulatory market, like we're starting to see hopefully emerge very soon in the aviation sector, the CORSIA, when you're buying for regulatory purposes, there tends to be less importance in the story because you have a regulation that has to be met. Yeah. So oftentimes corporates will source the least cost emissions for the majority of that portfolio. They still may be really interested in having a portion of their portfolio from these really highly compelling stories. When we're talking about the jurisdictional scale, I think we're likely to see that be primarily of interest to countries. So under the trading mechanisms in the Paris Agreement or Article 6, likely I think that finance might flow more jurisdiction to jurisdiction when we're talking about RED. So there's a real opportunity there for markets at scale. However, I think there are some corporates that are quite interested in the jurisdictional level because they have a huge scale to address. So when you're talking about, some of the big emitters out there that have a huge footprint that they really need to address, they are interested in scale because they have such a high volume that they need to purchase. So again, they might be interested in doing large transactions at scale, maybe with the jurisdictional level, but then also investing in site-specific activities or project activities that tell a story. Right. So again, they can kind of blend it all together in terms of, doing the right thing, meeting their regulation, going beyond that regulation to, carbon neutrality in many cases, and telling a story at the same time.
And I guess that's where the nesting issue comes in?
Yes, very much so. So nesting, probably first to clarify, is useful, right? What we're talking about is how do we integrate these projects that happen in a specific place into jurisdictional accounting for a few reasons. One, to avoid any double counting, and two, to make sure that these site-specific activities don't add up to more than is achieved at a jurisdictional level. So it's really important.
And that's been an issue, right, hasn't it?
It's been an issue, and I think it's important to clarify how and why it's an issue, because the logic of the accounting is different.
Maybe we should just clarify, put it in plain English as well.
Sure.
Because I think basically what you're saying is that there are cases where you look at all these individual projects and they've each reduced their emissions based on modeling. And if you add up all of the emission reductions that they've achieved, it comes to a higher amount than the total emission reductions in the jurisdiction itself, right? Is that... Or am I getting that wrong? It sounds like...
Does that actually occur? I don't think we know. Does it look like that occurs because of the way that those individual baselines on the reference level of the jurisdiction have come together? Yeah, we've seen that. So that's where I think it's really useful to clarify how it works.
Right.
So at a project level, what you're doing when you set the baseline, or in other words, what would happen if I didn't implement this project on the ground, you're looking very specifically at the dynamics in a given area. So you're looking at the level of threat of deforestation. But you're also working on a small enough scale that you can do much finer grained analysis. So you're using higher resolution satellite data. You're using more specific emission factors. In other words, how much carbon is stored in this specific site. So you're looking very specifically at the ecological dynamics in that place and having an accurate number of the amount of carbon that's stored in that ecosystem. When you're working at a jurisdictional scale, you're often using averages, you're using default factors, you're looking across an entire jurisdiction that may not be nearly as fine-grained in its analysis. So oftentimes that national or subnational level, the jurisdictional level, is far more conservative in its estimation because it's using less fine-grained data. So then when you try to put those two things together, they don't match up because it's a different type of measurement.
Right.
So what we're trying to do is drive more harmonization so that we don't raise issues of credibility, even though in reality those numbers at the project level are not necessarily wrong, and the jurisdictional level is not necessarily wrong, right? We're confident at that level that the results are accurate. They just are very conservative.
Right. Okay, that makes a lot of sense, because I've heard this before, and I know that my own personal experience with certain projects, the Souris project is one that I know most closely.
I need to intervene for a second here because I brought up a subject that we're going to be referencing a few more times. The Souris Forest Carbon Project
was led by an indigenous leader named Naomi Swickard of the Paite Suduri indigenous people of the Brazilian Amazon. These people lived in isolation from the outside world up until the late 1960s, when the government of Brazil began settling the remoter regions of the Amazon. I should do a whole episode on the Paite Suduri because I know them very well. I know their story. I've spent time down there. And their story is really the story of the human race and our interrelationship with nature, our dysfunctional relationship with nature in microcosm. At the time of first contact, the Paite Suduri numbered 5,000 people, but more than 90% of them died of tuberculosis and smallpox, diseases that Europeans were immune to because of years of living with animals, but against which the Paite Suduri and other indigenous people had no immunity. Then came loggers chopping the forest that the Paite Suduri called home. It's a fascinating story. I wish I could go into it more here, and I really would like to go into more detail in the future. For today's show, the important thing for you to know is that in 2009, their chief, Naomi Swickard, created the world's first indigenous-led REDD Plus project using the methods that we're discussing on today's show. Basically, they worked with consultants and outside organizations, including Forest Trends, which publishes Ecosystem Marketplace. That's how I got to know them. They mapped the drivers of deforestation, the illegal logging that they were engaged in, and they came up with a baseline of deforestation that would occur if they didn't get funding to counter it. What they needed was money to develop sustainable businesses like fish farming and handicrafts, and of course, monitoring the forest, hiring rangers, indigenous people who would act as forest rangers. Long story short, the project worked really well. They got the money, they were developing these sustainable businesses, and then diamonds were discovered in their territory. And the models just hadn't accounted for that. Suddenly, they were overrun with diamond speculators who colluded with some of the same members of the Suduri. These tribes are not homogenous. They're just like we are. They have their good guys and their bad guys. The local authorities wouldn't help them. Eventually, the project was put on hold. And they went from being the first indigenous-led forest carbon project, great success story, to being the first forest carbon project that failed and that needed to access the VCS buffer pool, which we'll also be talking about on today's show. If you want to hear more about the Suduri Forest Carbon Project, and if you want more Bionic Planet in general, then you can help me generate these episodes by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Bionic Planet. That's patreon.com/Bionic Planet. If you're on the legacy system, that system is working, but I can't seem to get it to work on the new website that I switched to. It doesn't show up, so you have to stick with Patreon, unless you're already supporting me on the old system. Anyway, there you can support me for as little as $1 per episode, and again with a monthly cap. The address again, patreon.com/Bionic Planet. Of course, you can also help just by accessing me through the right podcatcher. Namely, access me through the Radio Public app. That's Radio Public, like public radio, but backwards. They automatically pay me a few pennies for every listener who hears the show to the end, and that adds up. Finally, you can help just by giving me a 5-star review on whichever podcatcher you hear me through. That helps, because the more stars I get, the more ears I get. The more ears I get, the more minds I can reach. And we have to reach hundreds of millions of minds if we're to meet this challenge. We can do it if we all work together. Now back to my interview with Naomi Swickard. We were discussing again the Suduri Forest Carbon Project. And in that case, the threats were clearly higher than what people initially perceived. They didn't know that there was going to be diamonds discovered there. They didn't know that the local authorities weren't really going to provide the law enforcement. There were so many factors that made ending deforestation there so hard. And I know a lot of projects are facing this, where they have security issues. It's really a lot harder to end deforestation at the small scale than they realized. But at the same time, you hear this idea that the baselines maybe have been set too aggressively.
And it turns out that's not necessarily the case.
Yeah, exactly. And in Suruí, you could probably say that baseline was in fact significantly underestimated.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's a good point. I think that it also just emphasizes why this nested architecture is so important, because you do need the involvement of the jurisdiction. You do need that political commitment to addressing deforestation at scale, because the government has a very specific and unique role to play. They need to set the policy. They need to set the regulation, the enabling environment, whereby you can add on to that this private investment or nonprofit investment into communities that are working very specifically on those site scale dynamics. And without those two things working together, you can have pressures that make things difficult. The most dynamic system, the most effective system going forward, I think, is going to be a combination of those two. Because the government can then, make sure that the accounting is adding up at the governmental level, set the right policies and instruments, and hopefully be able to, increasingly be able to enforce them. Mm. But it's also really important that we have that site level activity, because a government doesn't have the ability to work with every single community across its forest estate.
Right.
And oftentimes the drivers of deforestation, some of them can be addressed at a national level. So, for example, Indonesia's moratorium on logging. That's a great example of what government can do. But they don't have the ability to say that in this particular community, what's driving that deforestation. And it might be a completely different driver. It might be more slash and burn agriculture. And it's not about, logging. It might be more community resources. So by working specifically in that site and with that community, you can help the community members decide how they want that future to change and what types of activities they would like to see in order to help leave the forest standing. And that's very, very difficult for a government to do across the whole country. So the combination of those two things can help us to drive significant finance to local areas, to local communities, in combination and hopefully harmonized with what the government is trying to do.
And that's, again, the big challenge. How do you harmonize this?
Right.
And how do you harmonize it?
Yeah, it's a good question, and one we've been working on for a long time. When we started out, we had this idea that the most effective way to do that would be to essentially spatially model where deforestation was occurring across the jurisdiction. So in other words, when you're coming up with that reference level or the deforestation at a jurisdictional scale, you're also looking at predicting where the deforestation would occur. That, unfortunately, is far too complex for most governments. We need to meet them at an earlier stage to make sure this is really viable and that we're driving most of the finance into mitigation and not into consultants designing models, right?
Right, yeah.
So
yeah.
That's one of the changes that's really occurred, is really just thinking, we need to simplify. And so what we're thinking now, and what's in our consultation that was just released, is that instead of doing this sort of complicated modeling, we're saying, let's start with the jurisdictional reference level and then allocate that down. And you can use a really, really simple approach to do that. One example would be to say, if you map where deforestation has occurred in the last year or last 5 years, and then you just say it's most likely that the next set of deforestation is going to occur within 1 kilometer of that. You would
because the roads are there and everything.
Roads and access and patterns of deforestation, they tend to expand out from existing deforestation, right? So if you just use that as a model, then a project that's in a specific place would say, okay, I'm within this distance of this previous deforestation. That's going to be my baseline going forward. That's one approach. It's an example. In reality, there's a few more factors that are generally used, but we can make those very simple and still hopefully end up with the ability to really recognize where deforestation is occurring in that jurisdiction. Because the challenge is, you could take an even more simple approach. You could just say, okay, I've got, 500 hectares of deforestation across my whole jurisdiction, and I've got, 200 hectares left. I'm just going to divide that out, call it good, right?
Right.
The problem with that is you would then be saying that the deforestation rate is the same in every plot of every parcel across your whole country, which we know is not the case, right? There are hotspot areas. There are places that are extremely threatened, and there are those that are very remote and don't face as much threat. So we want to make sure that we're driving the incentive to invest in places with a high threat of deforestation, rather than driving an incentive to invest somewhere that there's no threat of deforestation. So we still need these approaches to understand where that deforestation is occurring and then use that to set the project baseline. So by starting with the jurisdiction and what they've already done and allocating it down, we can make sure that everything adds up. You don't have a window that is greater than what is happening at a jurisdictional scale.
And that's an issue that's come up a lot too, because you have these areas where indigenous people live. They've always been considered the guardians of the forest, and they are. They maintain the forest, and they don't really get rewarded for it. And they have healthcare issues, and they also have temptation. I've seen it happen. I'm sure you have too, where they feel the need to sell off part of their forest or let loggers in, or what happened with the Souris. How do you deal with situations where these indigenous people or these other forest people have been such good stewards of the forest, and now all this finance is flowing into areas where people have maybe not been very good stewards, and the people who have been good stewards are not getting any of it? Can that be dealt with within this system?
Absolutely. And first and foremost, I would say we absolutely need to make sure that indigenous communities are rewarded for what they've done. We have a number of projects that are, in fact, with indigenous communities. So I think it's a bit of a misnomer to say that none of the finance is flowing to them. But of course, we need to scale that finance significantly. But there's sort of two different ways you can do that. One is by directly rewarding where the emission reductions are occurring. And again, for the most part, those are in areas that are quite threatened. They're the ones on the forest frontier. Now, are indigenous communities in those places? Absolutely. So for some of them, they have the opportunity to really work directly in their areas that are quite threatened and establish projects or programs with the government to reduce emissions and be directly rewarded for that on a per ton basis. That's what we see in projects. That's what we see in an offset type option, right?
Right.
But there's also ways to drive finance that aren't based on that and might be more appropriate where those indigenous communities are conserving an area that is less threatened, or they have a lot less historical deforestation because they've done such a great job. And that might better be done through benefit sharing mechanisms. So some of the finance from the achievement of these programs can be directed to those communities under a benefit sharing plan, while you still make sure that you're also rewarding those that are directly undertaking activities in high threat areas. So those don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can do both, and a good structure that a government can really put in place would do both of those things.
Which is kind of what the state of Acre did.
I was just going to mention Brazil. Yes. So Brazil has taken a really interesting approach, not just Acre, but the Amazon states together, where they've essentially undertaken an allocation, not just of the reference level, but to figure out who should benefit from that. And so there's a portion that's sort of reserved for indigenous communities, there's a portion reserved for government, there's a portion reserved for protected areas and for private sector. I might be missing something.
Yeah, and
there.
I think there is one other, there's one other, there is another constituent, but...
Yeah. But point being, they've already said, look, this is really important to us. The government needs to pay for the program, so they obviously need to accrue some of that. The indigenous communities are extremely important and need to benefit from this, so we're going to reserve a portion for them. And then if you do want to do a private project, we have an envelope for that. We recognize that there is a benefit to attracting outside finance for mitigation, especially in these complicated areas or on private land where that landowner has the ability to make a choice about what they're doing. And it's really important to make sure that those that are changing their habits, that are sometimes taking a financial hit by not undertaking an activity that would have deforested, get rewarded for that. Otherwise, you remove the incentive to do so.
Yeah. Or you just don't help them. I mean, it's the interesting thing I've found is their incentive is to keep the forest, but they have needs.
Yeah, exactly.
And they suffer when they're without health care.
We cannot expect people to just, as much as they might really want to maintain that forest, people have needs, and we cannot just tell people you can't deforest if that's going to undermine their livelihood, right?
Yeah.
Fundamentally, we have to change the trajectory of development in these places in order to achieve something at the same time that we're not having harm on local communities.
Yeah, and again, the big issue on that is people often ask, why should we be paying them? And I think the answer is, we created the mess, and
yes.
we should be,
we
helping.
have an obligation.
Yeah. Another question, another constituent or constituency that's out there are these project developers, because these guys, a lot of them they've taken huge risks. They've borrowed money. They've got investors. They've gone out and they've proactively saved big patches of the forest, and they're not exactly rolling in dough right now either. They've been struggling the last few years, and now that the markets are kind of coming around, they're able to sell their offsets. But there's a lot of concern among some of these project developers who did go out there and proactively take action that if these jurisdictional programs kick in, their offsets are not going to be recognized anymore. Is this something you guys are trying to, because you need to make sure that they need to know, you have to send a signal to people like that they're not going to be left in the lurch.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's really important that we recognize the need to have some continuity. Of course, investors know there's a risk, and there's political risk around the world to changing in regulations that private investors are accustomed to.
Yeah.
But that said, particularly when we're talking about the red space, it's not just about that investment, right? It's far more about the activity and the impact on the ground. So these investments have gone to preserving really critical forest areas around the world. So if we cut off that investment tomorrow, we potentially undermine the commitments that they've made to local communities and the protection measures that they've put in place for those forests. So we're not just talking about cutting off finance or cutting off somebody's bottom line, which... instead, what's more important is really that we're not cutting off the impact that they've been having.
Yeah, all the progress will backslide. These huge areas that are protected now will suddenly be unprotected.
May no longer be. So I think it's really important to integrate them. At the same time, we also have to recognize that governments are responsible for the overall outcome. And with governments now setting their own nationally determined contributions or goals for mitigation, they need to be able to accurately account across the whole jurisdiction and ensure that it all adds up. So there is a need to come together, and there's a need to find sort of a middle ground that might be more conservative than the original estimation in projects, but also still provides sufficient finance to them to continue so that they can continue to protect those areas and deliver to communities. And so that's exactly what this set of guidance and options that we've just put out in our consultation is about. That's what nesting is about. It's about coming up with viable ways to bring those two scales together in a way that ensures the integrity of the accounting, ensures that the projects are in support of the government goals, but that we're still able to drive finance to mitigation on the ground.
Now, I know you've just put this out there, but when we did the State of Voluntary Carbon Markets report, we found this huge increase in red finance in 2018, and it almost the entire increase came from Peru, and it was because of the nesting program that's being done there. And I guess I'm not clear on that. They were all VCS-CCB. But was this your nesting, or was this a government initiative? How? What was it? What exactly was that, and how does it relate? What lessons are in that? So there's a couple countries that have come quite far already in their approach to nesting. So Peru and Colombia have kind of been leading the way, and Peru has set in place a number of regulations and concepts around how they're intending to integrate projects into their government approach. They're still kind of figuring out the last details of that, and particularly this allocation element I was talking about earlier. How do you allocate down from the jurisdictional reference level to what does a project achieve, and what's the project baseline in that context? So because they knew there was a lack of full clarity on that, they said, we know that the projects need certainty. We know that the projects need recognition and a transitional period. And they, in fact, issued a letter to those projects that said, we recognize that you exist and are legitimate, and we recognize that you can use your existing project baseline for a certain period of time. And that gave the investors the certainty that the units, the credits being produced from those projects up through, I think it's through the end of 2020, it might be, I think it's through the end of 2020, are going to be fully accounted for by the government. So they will deduct that from what the government has achieved and ensure there's no double counting. So that was a big step. So even though it's not yet a fully nested architecture, they're working on that and they plan to have that in place by 2021. It gave the certainty that those units would not be double counted, and that was fundamental to the investment. And that's why we've seen so much go into Peru. So I think it's a really powerful example of how once we get this architecture in place and have clarity over how the accounting at both scales is going to be implemented, and that the government, is recognizing these units and interested in continuing that private sector investment because it helps them achieve their targets. It helps them address deforestation.
that can drive significant finance. It's very attractive to a private sector actor that wants to invest in this to have that certainty.
Right. And another area of uncertainty is what happens when something goes bad. I know with the Souris project, diamond miners came in, destroyed more forests than they had saved, and they had to tap into the VCS buffer pool. And at the same time, we have all these fires going on in the Amazon and the Congo area too, and Indonesia. So, what happens? You've got these projects, you've got this money going into it, and then what happens if a fire comes along? I guess there's two questions: is how does, or maybe they're related? Does the buffer pool handle the fires? What happens if there's something catastrophic like this? How do you make sure the money isn't just right? Not the money not going up in smoke, but how do you make sure that you're still preserving the forest when you've got all these natural forces countering?
Yeah, it's challenging, right? But I think there's two parts to it. There's how does the buffer system work, and then there's what's actually happening on the ground. So in terms of how it works, essentially what we do, there's a tool called the non-permanence risk tool, and it's applied to every project at validation and at every verification, and it assesses the risk that something is going to undermine that place or the carbon stocks on which those units are based. And we use that to determine a percentage of units that are put aside in a global buffer pool. And we're pooling across all the projects across all the countries. So in the case that you do have a loss, like what happened in Souris, we can then use the buffer to compensate for any credits that have been lost on the ground, making sure that the investment that was made in the credit is still real, that emission reduction was still real. So if you have lost on the ground 100 tons, for example, we're pulling 100 tons out of the buffer and canceling them. So they've never been used by anyone else, making sure that there's still been that same number of units or tons of emission reduction have occurred in the field. So that is how we really make sure that the emission reductions that are bought and sold and used by companies are permanent.
And the amount, real quick, the amount that is paid into the buffer pool is pretty significant too, right? It's like 15-20% sometimes.
Yeah, it can be a lot more than that, but the average is around there. And it's a significant part of the investment for a project to put this into the buffer pool. The other thing that I think is really interesting to talk through is how effective the projects have actually been at stopping some of this. So we do have examples where they just weren't able to address the forces. And when you're talking about diamonds, it's very difficult to overcome that, right? Yeah. But when we're talking about forces like fire, so we saw this year a huge increase in fires in Brazil and in Indonesia. And all of our projects are required to submit a report if they lose anything in the field. But we took the extra step this year to do an analysis ourselves of the whole portfolio in some of those hotspot countries, looking at what was the fire's potential impact on our projects and our portfolio and ultimately the buffer system and overall integrity. And what we initially found was that there was a significant number of our projects that had fires very close by. And so we sort of looked at, do we need to be concerned about this? We ran some analysis. No, our buffer pool was healthy and could cover even if we lost all those projects, but it was still significant. We went back again more recently, so 6 months later, and found that in reality at that point, less than 1% of our projects were actually at risk. And when we started looking at specific projects, in some cases they were ringed by fire hotspots, but the project itself was totally intact, or it might have had a few small fires or small areas burn, but when you compared it to the surrounding area, you could really see a dramatic difference. And so they've been incredibly effective at protecting those really critical areas. And so it was really interesting to see that it's working. It's working on the ground, and the buffer system is maintaining its integrity. The projects are maintaining their integrity. So there will be some losses, right? We're dealing with incredibly difficult forces, and we're dealing with nature and the unpredictability of that, and increases in climate change and all of that. What's critical is that we design the system in a way that if there are those losses, they can be compensated for, and then that's how the buffer system really works.
Wow. Just when you saw that these projects were not getting burned, is that because these are not wildfires? It's because these are fires set by man, and they just weren't letting people in, or were they actually actively fighting the fires with water and stuff like that?
It's a bit of both. So oftentimes what happens is that the fires initially are set in a controlled way, but they get out of control. It gets windy or it's very dry and they spread. And that's when we really see the big damaging fires across the tropics. what the projects are often doing on the ground is having a fire break, and then they're having fire spotters. And so in one of the projects we were looking at carefully, they had both of those things in place. They had put people on the ground and are employing community members to be fire spotters. And so when there was a localized fire, they were able to go and respond directly to that, where it was inside the project area or nearby, right along their frontier. And so they're essentially fire management was very successful. And they're working with the communities that are inside the project area to not use the controlled burning as the way that they're clearing land so that they're not causing those fires inside the project. So they've really changed the way that people work, and that's been quite effective.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah, and we're running out of time, unfortunately, here. But did you have anything you wanted to say in closing? Anything we didn't touch on that you think is important, or have we hit the big issues here?
I think we've hit on the big issues. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, what we're really trying to do is drive finance to the most mitigation that we can on the ground as quickly as possible. And there's multiple ways to do that. And I think that's really important, that we are driving finance to different scales and different types of activity, both at the government level and the project level, if we really want to make this successful in the long term.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Naomi Swickard of Verra and the Verified Carbon Standard, wrapping up this episode of Bionic Planet, the first episode that I've managed to produce in over a month. If you like Bionic Planet and you want more and better episodes, then you can help me generate them by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Bionic Planet. That's patreon.com/Bionic Planet, Bionic Planet, all one word, no dots or dashes. There you can support me for as little as $1 per episode and with a monthly cap. Obviously, the more the better. If you can afford more, give it to me. The address again is patreon.com/Bionic Planet. Finally, you can help by giving me a 5-star review on whichever podcast you hear me through. This helps because the more stars I get, the more ears I get. And the more ears I get, the more minds I can reach. And we have to reach hundreds of millions of minds if we're to meet this challenge. We can do it if we all work together. And that wraps up today's show. I'm Steve Zwick, locked down in Chicago. Thanks for listening.